amulets of touching, seeing, groping, hearing, and loving, we call upon the powers of the cosmos to protect our ceremonies. In the name of Zeus, in the name of Anubis, god of the dead, in the name of all those skilled for causes they do not comprehend.
It was described as bizarre, strange, outlandish, and at the same time brilliant, magical, and the perfect absurdly inspiring protest for the time. It helped mark a turning point in the American attitude towards the Vietnam War. It was a moment that turned into a movement and spread across the country, giving rise to a new wave of political protest and becoming a cultural touchstone for the 60s.
Straight creeps in the rice paddy daddy. Did he want? It's true what they say about a Ho Chi Minh.
By the end of 1966, the number of American troops in Vietnam had reached 385,000. 6,000 American soldiers had been killed that year alone, and the annual cost of the war had risen to over $20 billion. As American forces grew stronger, so did opposition to U.S. involvement in the war. More and more Americans are questioning the morality of the war and whether it was worth fighting. Even soldiers began to distrust the reasons for being in Vietnam, as well as President Johnson's assurances that the U.S. was winning. The movement against the war started small on college campuses, but quickly gained momentum as the conflict escalated, and the U.S. military began regular bombings of North Vietnam. The National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, also known as MOB, coordinated thousands of local anti-war groups into large-scale demonstrations across the country. MOB represented a broad range of activists, from the Socialist Workers' Party to the Communist Party and Quakers. Their philosophies may have been different, but their message was the same: end the war in Vietnam and withdraw American troops. In the spring of '67, MOB began planning for a massive demonstration in Washington, the largest protest yet against the Vietnam War. The original concept was for protesters to march from the Lincoln Memorial to the steps of the Capitol building, but when MOB invited radical activist Jerry Rubin to be project director of the event, things took a creative turn. Rubin, the flamboyant anti-war radical from Berkeley, who famously preached never to trust anyone over the age of 30, didn't like the idea of occupying the Capitol because he thought it would be seen as an attack on the democratic process. Instead, Rubin wanted the protest to target the heart of the war machine, the nerve center of the U.S. military, the Pentagon. So Rubin began hatching a plan that would forever change the tenor of anti-war protests. Not only would they shut down the Pentagon, but they would raise the building off the ground and exorcise the evil spirits from within, thus ending the war in Vietnam. To accomplish this spectacular feat, Rubin teamed up with fellow dissidents, including anarchist and revolutionary Abbie Hoffman, beat poet Allen Ginsberg, and counterculture icon Ed Sanders of the New York rock band, the Fugs.
So I went to my friend, the filmmaker and artist, Harry Smith, who was also a magician, and asked Harry how one could exorcise the Pentagon. And he gave me instructions, told me to do things. He advocated circling the Pentagon with a circle of grain or corn and various things. So I wrote and put together an exorcism.
Since the levitation and exorcism would also require forming a human circle around the Pentagon, Abbie Hoffman, well known for his provocative publicity stunts, went to D.C. to calculate the number of protesters it would take to surround the 3.5 million square foot building. Everybody knows that a five-sided figure is evil, Hoffman explained to the press. The way to exorcise it is with a circle. Hand in hand and arms outstretched, he and a friend walked around the Pentagon, counting body widths. The stunt got Hoffman arrested. MOB and the government negotiated every detail of the planned protest, with each side reluctant to back down. In the end, it was agreed that the marchers would not encircle the building. They would also have to stay in the north parking lot, which was across the Jefferson Davis Highway and several hundred feet from the Pentagon. Rubin, unhappy with the compromise, was concerned that their vision was getting lost, and at first wanted to end negotiations with the government. But he understood that it was necessary, and even if they weren't able to shut down the Pentagon, the media coverage of the exorcism would at the very least be fuel for the anti-war movement. To stir up more publicity, Hoffman told the press that he applied for a permit to levitate the Pentagon 300 feet off the ground. Time magazine would later report that a compromise was reached and the government gave permission to raise the building a maximum of 10 feet into the air. Hoffman had successfully captured the media's attention.
And we're going to assemble a mass of holy men to surround the Pentagon. And they're going to surround it with chanting and love and drum beating. And the Pentagon is going to rise into the air on October 21st. And when it gets about 300 feet in the air, it's going to start to vibrate. Slowly at first, and then a little quicker. And all the evil spirits are going to pour out.
On October 21st, 1967, more than 100,000 demonstrators gathered at the Lincoln Memorial on the D.C. Mall. They include everyone from hippies and housewives, college professors, clergy, and war veterans. They lined the reflecting pool for a performance by folk singer Phil Oakes and listened to speeches by writer Norman Mailer, poet Robert Lowell, and famous pediatrician Benjamin Spock, who would become an outspoken critic of President Johnson and the war. Afterwards, about 50,000 of the protesters, carrying colorful banners and chanting, began to march across the Arlington Memorial Bridge toward the Pentagon. When they reached the north parking lot, protesters were confronted by a line of helmeted military police with bayonets attached to their rifles, along with thousands of National Guard and Army troops. The plan, at that point, was to fly over and drop flowers onto the Pentagon while the exorcism was taking place, but authorities at the airport had intervened.
So I had a bunch of white daisies on my hands, so I gave them out to protesters, and there's a picture of one protester inserting a white daisy into the rifle of a soldier. They were very serious. They had soldiers with weapons faced out protecting the front steps of the Pentagon. So we after the demonstration, we went up to the front of the Pentagon to where these soldiers were. They were just trembling young kids.
As the crowd gathered, Sanders, decked out in orange and yellow, delivered the exorcism from the back of a rented truck.
Thule Kupferberg and I of the Fugs got on this flatbed truck, and we drove across the river to the Pentagon and parked at the edge of the parking lot as close as we could get to the Pentagon. And then I delivered a sing-song exorcism. So we chanted, "Out demons out, out demons out, out demons out."
While most remained peaceful that day, some of the demonstrators tried to get past the military police, breaking through the makeshift barriers around the Pentagon. There were confrontations and brawls. Police fired tear gas in the crowd and clubbed protesters with rifle butts. By the time the demonstration ended, several hundred protesters had been arrested, including Norman Mailer, who would write about the event in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Armies of the Night.
Film crews come from all over the world to ask me about the exorcism of the Pentagon. And I always say, well, we did levitate and exorcise the Pentagon, but we forgot to twirl it. So it didn't have efficacy, because after our exorcism of October of '67, the war went on for another 7 years. So it was sort of like the current war against Iraq. It just won't stop, won't cease. It goes on and on and on.
By most accounts, the Pentagon didn't rise 300 feet off the ground that day, or even 10. But something else did happen. For the first time, the hippie counterculture stood up to the establishment, marking a shift in the anti-war movement from protest to resistance. They opposed what many thought was an absurd war with an absurd gesture of defiance. Not only did the spectacle capture the nation's attention, but it also paved the way for many other creative political movements over the past 50 years, many of which would awaken civic consciousness and help bring about social and political change.
We call upon the powers of the cosmos to protect our ceremonies. In the name of Zeus, in the name of Anubis, god of the day, in the name of millions of dead in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the East, in the name of all those died for causes they do not comprehend.